Chapter 1. The Boundary of Dreams. The nightmare wasn't new, but its edges were sharper tonight. Tonight, the shadows were not just deep, they were hungry. They writhed, coalescing into forms that shifted at the periphery of his vision. Forms that Damien Endy knew intimately, yet could never quite grasp. He was 16, a boy whose eyes saw the world in a kaleidoscope of too many colors, too many sounds, too many meanings. Diagnosed with autism and a learning disorder, his words often came out in stilted phrases, a frustrating dam against the torrent of thoughts that surged within him. But his inner world? That was a vibrant, chaotic landscape, a tapestry woven with stories and monsters, heroes and unspeakable fears. This particular dream had started, as they often did, with the unsettling feeling of being watched, not just observed, but hunted. Eyes, burning with a cold, ancient malice, had pierced through the heavy shadows of his mind, locking onto him, consuming him. He tried to run, to scream, but his dream body was lead, his voice a forgotten echo. The pressure built, a suffocating weight that pressed down until Damien jolted awake, a strangled gasp tearing from his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed a stark, unforgiving 3:17 a.m. This Wednesday, the 22nd, was a day etched in his memory with a dull, aching dread. It was Ellie Talley's last day at church before heading off to college. Ellie, his most steadfast friend, the one who understood him with a look, the one who translated the world into simple terms when it all felt too much. She was his anchor in a world that often spun too fast, too loud, too incomprehensible. The scent of stale coffee and old hymn books clung to the air in the church fellowship hall, a familiar comfort that was now tinged with the bitter tang of impending loss. Ellie sat across from him at a scarred wooden table, her usually bright eyes holding a wistful sheen. Blaine and Hampton, her sisters, flanked her, their faces mirroring Ellie's subdued mood. "I can't believe this is it," Ellie said, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "My last Wednesday service before college." Blaine, ever the mature one, reached out to pat Ellie's arm. "We're going to miss you, Ellie. The whole place is going to be so boring without you." Hampton, bold and determined even at 17, playfully punched Blaine in the arm. "Don't act like you haven't been dying to leave too, Blaine," she teased, a flicker of her usual spirit breaking through the gloom. Blaine laughed, a short, self-deprecating sound. Okay, fair enough, but it was fun while it lasted." "All of us, here." Her gaze swept over the table, lingering on Damien for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Damien's gaze, usually fixed on the intricate patterns of the rough-hewn table, lifted for a moment. His eyes, a shade of deep hazel that often seemed to hold unspoken galaxies, met Ellie's. A small, almost imperceptible smile flickered on his face, a fragile warmth in the chill of his anxiety. Before he returned his attention to a small, smooth stone he was meticulously tracing with his thumb. It was his grounding stone, a tactile comfort against the maelstrom in his mind. Emily's smile, though tinged with sadness, was meant to reassure. "Don't worry, bud. I'll be back." But the words meant to soothe felt like a cruel deception. Back wasn't here. Back meant a future, a distance, a chasm of time Damien wasn't sure how to bridge without her. The thought of her leaving created a void inside him, a hollow echo that threatened to swallow him whole. It wasn't merely sadness. It was a physical ache, a sense of falling, of losing the only handhold he had. He'd even considered running away, fleeing the church, disappearing into the dense, comforting anonymity of the woods behind their house, anything to escape the gaping hole her absence would leave behind. And worse, a darker, more terrifying thought had whispered in his mind: put an end to it all. The idea was a cold, alien thing, but the sheer, overwhelming emptiness it promised felt almost preferable to the sharp, unbearable pain of her departure. His mother, Laura, ever perceptive of her son's nonverbal cues, had caught the desperation in his eyes days ago, the way Damien clutched his hands, the subtle tremor in his lower lip. Laura's voice had been firm but gentle, her hand a steady presence on Damien's shoulder. "I need you here with me." The words had pulled Damien back from the precipice, reminding him that he wasn't entirely alone, even if the thought of Ellie leaving still felt like a piece of him was being torn away. Days before Ellie's departure, Blaine had requested a story from Damien. "I was wondering if you can write a story about me and my sister's lives," she'd said, her eyes earnest. A chronicle of their lives, something that would display the bonds they shared within their church community. It was a thoughtful request, a way to involve Damien in a medium he understood and excelled at, even if his verbal communication was often a struggle. Laura, ever perceptive of her son's fascination with fantasy and the intricate worlds he built in his mind, suggested adding a monster. "That's a great idea, Blaine. And Damien, you love those big monsters, don't you? Maybe you could add a creature to the story, a challenge for them to overcome." "Something big, son, like Godzilla," he'd offered, knowing Damien's love for colossal creatures that embodied immense power. The creature Damien conjured for his story became a grotesque fusion. It had the powerful, theropod build of a dinosaur, a primordial force of nature, but its mind, its cunning, its malevolent intelligence was drawn from Fagin, the villainous bird from the 1990 Danish animated film War of the Birds, also known as the Bird War, or the Bird War in Kanafleskoven. Fagin, manipulative and cruel, embodied the fear of betrayal and isolation. This composite monster became a monstrous allegory for Jake's inner turmoil. His fear of isolation, his struggle to connect, a tangible representation of the feelings that often felt too big, too monstrous to articulate in words. It was the crushing weight of his anxieties, the beast that gnawed at his sense of self-worth, the terrifying chaos that threatened to consume his inner world. "They said it was my dream," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible in the quiet of his bedroom after the church service. He was back in his bed, the echoes of the dream still clinging to him. The monster was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. They said it wasn't real. Damien shifted in his eye, a slight frown creasing his brow, his hands clenching at the sheets. But some dreams, they bleed into the real. But the first draft of his story had been a torrent of dark, untamed emotion. It hadn't been a narrative so much as an outpouring, a visceral scream on paper, filled with graphic violence and gore that would have made even the most seasoned slasher film director wince. It was raw, unfiltered, a window into the tumultuous world that often raged beneath Jake's quiet demeanor. He hadn't held back, hadn't filtered. The monster devoured, it tore, it stalked with cold intent, reflecting the true horror of his internal landscape. Writing it had been a release, a way to pin down the nebulous fear that constantly haunted him, to give form to the formless terror of loneliness. But this was for church. It was for his friends, his community, not a horror film. They wouldn't understand. They would be confused, perhaps even frightened, by the darkness in his creation. They wouldn't see the allegory, the representation of his pain. They would only see the monster. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the neighborhood, Laura sat at Damien's desk. He was surrounded by the chaotic drafts and illustrations of Damien's story, a sea of scribbled notes and frantic sketches. Laura's brow was furrowed, his expression a mix of concern and a deep, empathetic understanding. "It's intense, isn't it?" Laura sighed, running a hand through his hair. He poured so much of himself into this. She picked up a page, his eyes scanning a horrifying depiction of the Fagin dinosaur hybrid. The creature's eyes, rendered in Damien's distinctive style, burned with that same malice he'd felt watching him in his dream. Luckily, he wasn't alone. Leah Hannon, 17, its closest friend from high school, possessed an almost uncanny ability to understand his mind. She sat perched on the edge of Damien's bed, her own artistic eye taking in the swirling chaos of the desk. She knew Damien, truly knew him, in a way few others did. Leah slipped through a page of visceral depictions of the monster, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of its claws. Yeah, intense is one word for it, Leah sighed, a small shiver running down her spine. Maybe terrifying is another. But that's Damien, right? She asked Laura. He doesn't do things in half measures. Laura nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at a particularly detailed drawing of the creature, its maw gaping. I know. The monster reminds me of, well, you know, how he loves those dinosaur movies. But I think he's using it to work through some stuff. All this fear of Ellie leaving his isolation. Her voice trailed off, weighted with a mother's worry. Leah's eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Laura's. We can make it more church-appropriate. Less slasher film, she suggested, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. She understood the core of Damien's message, even if its presentation was violent. Thank you, Leah, so much, Laura said, relief evident in her voice. I was really starting to worry how we'd manage this. Maybe recasting it as a dream will soften the edges. He gestured to a particularly graphic image. Give it a layer of unreality, so it's not quite so literal. I like that. It keeps the heart of his story, too, Leah responded, already picturing how they might reframe the narrative. And it'll give him a more defined way of explaining his struggles. A dream is a safe space to explore scary things. Laura glanced at Damien's clock, a flicker of worry in her eyes, beyond the story. We'll need to come up with a solution fast. I'm having surgery next week. The words hung in the air, a new layer of anxiety settling over the room. It wasn't life-threatening, but it meant Laura would be out of commission for a while, making her less available to support Damien. The timing felt cruelly ironic, coinciding with Ellie's departure. Damien, who had been listening from the doorway, his head aching with the lingering shadows of his dream, shuffled into the room. He heard the urgency in his mother's voice, the concern. Come on, Mom, it'll be fine, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, his usual stilted phrases softened by fatigue. He knew his mother didn't understand the full scope of his internal battle, the way the monster was not merely a story, but a living, breathing entity in his mind. No one did. Not fully, anyway. The weight of this responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. The story, his story, was more than just words on a page. It was a testament to his fears, to his fragile connections, to the world he felt slipping away. They had agreed to work on it again tomorrow, and then a final edit as a team the day after. But as the night deepened, and the rhythmic ticking of his clock seemed to echo the frantic pounding of his heart, Damien felt a restless energy stir within him. He couldn't wait. He wouldn't wait. Unbeknownst to his mother and Leah, who had both gone to bed, confident in their plan for the morning, Damien pulled out his notebooks, his pens, his carefully organized piles of paper. He flicked on his desk lamp, its golden glow slicing through the bedroom's gloom. Tonight, he would not wait. Tonight, he would take charge. He would wrestle the story into shape. He would take the monster, and he would find the light within the darkness. For Ellie, for his friends, for himself. He rewrote scenes, his pen flying across the page, driven by a surge of desperate clarity. He refashioned characters, adding layers of subtlety he hadn't considered before. The monster, once purely malevolent, now occasionally paused, its eyes betraying a flicker of something akin to confusion. a hint of its own internal struggle. The victims, no longer mere fodder, developed fleeting moments of defiance, of connection, even in their terror. He tried to infuse moments of hope, of resilience, into the bleak landscape of his initial creation, weaving in the strength he saw in Ellie, Blaine, and Hampton, the quiet strength of his mother, the steadfast loyalty of Leah. He focused on the idea of the monster as a nightmare, a struggle within a character, an externalization of internal fear, rather than a literal external threat. The sky outside began to lighten, a faint gray edging over the horizon, painting the world in muted tones, when his pen finally slipped from his fingers. He had pushed himself too hard. His mind felt like a tangled skein of yarn, his thoughts blurring together. The world swam into blurry focus, and his eyes were heavy as lead, gritty with exhaustion. He tried to reach for the papers, to find his place, to make one more correction, but his body was too tired. The last thing he remembered was the cool touch of his desk against his cheek as he slumped down, a stack of papers askew underneath his head, the smell of ink and paper faint around him. As he drifted into sleep, no longer merely dreaming, but truly falling into the abyss of unconsciousness, the monstrous visions of his story once again began to take hold in his slumber. But they were different now. They were shaping themselves into new and unfamiliar forms, no longer entirely the beast he had initially conceived. The creature of claws and shadows, once a symbol of his isolation, now pulsed with a strange, unfamiliar power. It was no longer just part of his dream. It felt real. He knew somewhere in the depths of his weary mind that this was not the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was just the beginning. And he was no longer authoring the story. He realized with a jolt during his slumber, as the monster's form shifted and solidified in his mind's eye. He was living it. The echoes of light, which he hoped to find, seemed more distant than ever, swallowed by the growing, terrifying reality of the monster within.